morning, everybody. Good to see you all. So today we're going to continue utilizing this Maha Mantra. So the Maha Mantra, for those that might not have memorized it yet, I'm unsure. It is Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. And we're going to infuse that with two different breath techniques. And so the first breath technique we'll work with is Kapalbhati, so breath of fire. A quick example and demonstration. Fast rhythmic exhales coming out of the nose, and then more gentle passive inhales just to make sure that your lungs are full. It's always nice to remind yourself that this is a really shallow breath technique, and that over the course of the technique's use, your CO2 levels build, so there should be this mild sense of suffocation. So again, something like this. And what we're going to do with that breath technique, it's very rhythmic, right? It's 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2. You're gonna mentally repeat the Maha Mantra as you perform the breath technique. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. Hare Hare. Cool? Okay, and then we're going to get into Nadi Shodhana. So Nadi Shodhana, I'm not sure if we practice this together yet, but it's alternate nostril breathing. You're going to close the right nostril, inhale up the left, hold your breath and seal both nostrils. Exhale out the right, inhale up the right, close both nostrils, hold your breath, exhale out the left. And so your breath, your prana is moving in a very triangular pattern. Inhale up the right, sort of swirls around the third eye symbolically, exhales out the right. Then inhale up the right, swirls around the third eye symbolically, exhale out the left. And because this is more of it's a longer breath, it's a more passive and patient breath, your inhale will be one round of the Maha Mantra. So you inhale, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram, Hare Hare. Your top retention will be one round of the Maha Mantra, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram, Hare Hare. Exhale, same process. And then right away you're going to inhale up the right for the length of the Maha Mantra, hold your breath for the length of the Maha Mantra, exhale for the length of the Maha Mantra. And then now the question is, why exactly are we doing this and what is the benefit? And so for that, we're going to take a little detour and talk about the spiritual practice at large, the significance of the spiritual practice, the significance of Krishna, the significance of Ram, and the significance of pilgrimage to India and some beliefs around, what it means to be born Indian. And so the first point is, we are not, no person is an island, and we are deeply, deeply, deeply influenced by our culture and the world and the people and the conversations and the media and the signals and the symbols and the stimulus that we exist within. And for that reason, while you can meditate powerfully anywhere, depending on where you go, if you take the time to retreat into special spaces, the experience of your practice and therefore the experience of the divine or the experience of the inner self becomes more pronounced. And so while it's very easy to say, especially when you're in meditative communities, that it doesn't matter where you are, it actually does matter where you are. And if you build your little corner of the room and you infuse it with incense, or you infuse it with flowers, or you infuse it with images that are inspiring and sort of expanding conceptually and visually, it will have an impact over time. And so when you go to India, for example, and the reason why so many practitioners eventually make their way to the East is because when you look around these cities and when you make your way into these towns, and if you take the time to practice in ashrams, you are inundated with symbolism. And so your mind and your eyes and your senses only hear and see and perceive the concepts that you're sort of trying to build up in your mind, you see it out in the real world. And the conflation of both sort of the outer world reflecting the inner world and the inner world reflecting the outer world spiritually, it creates this really powerful, a really powerful and potent moment. And so when we're practicing, instead of counting, inhale 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, hold 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, those numbers are very sterile. They really don't mean anything to us at all except for the measurement of our breath. But if you replace those numbers with mantras that over time, if you take the time to study or develop emotional relationships too, the mantra now, instead of the numbers, supports and elevates the experience of your practice. Does that make sense? Yeah, cool. And so it's like, how do I study? How do I develop a relationship with these mantras and these words? A number of ways. The umbrella term is svadhyaya. You need to study yourself, and you need to study the scriptures and the scholars and the master yogis that came before. Many of them who existed in the sort of 17 to early 1900 range have biographies, or their students, their Western students wrote of them. And so if you take the time to read, essentially, the mantras will represent more to you. And if you take the time to practice, your memories of what occurs through your practice will become more will support the meaning of the mantra itself. And so that's one thing. Another concept is always nice to go back and remind ourselves, what's the big goal of this practice? What am I really doing here when I practice? You are attempting to empty the mind. Rahita. Rahita is the term. To vacate the mind of your dreams and your desires and your goals and your noble and selfless concerns for those that you love or the world. And of course also your fears and your regrets and your shames. And the curious question is, especially if we lean back into this idea that, we are not islands, we are not separate from our world. In my mind, McDonald's has territory, and Netflix has territory, and Nike has territory. If I need to recolonize that space and empty that space, as thinkers, as contemplatives, you want to consider, my mind is really crowded, it's very populated, it's like a cityscape, it's like Broadway, it's like Sunset Boulevard. What would happen if I just demolished all of that, took down all the billboards, took down all the neon signs, took down all of it, took down the traffic lights in the streets and the stores? What would the world become if my mind was that empty? And the answer to that is the goal of your practice. You don't know yet, but the little bits of emptiness you touch usually lead to the inspiration to continue practicing because it's fairly beautiful. And so that's the second point. And the last point is this: what do all of these stories, and in that the characters and deities within these stories essentially represent? All of them have to do with good overcoming evil. All of them involve or orbit some sort of war, some sort of struggle between one force and another force. But what does that struggle symbolize in us as meditators, and what were the authors of those narratives trying to tell the reader? Not necessarily the struggle of good over evil on a moral level, even though that's part of the process. The struggle is to choose a deeply spiritual life. That's the war, the personal war. The choice to meditate for longer and longer periods of time, the more difficult and more powerful and more costly choice, versus the choice to inundate yourself with worldly routines. If we, empathize with a Indian villager in the 1600s, the choice wasn't to build a brand or collect a pension. The choice was to, tend the fields and take care of the flock and rebuild the home. Whatever era we find ourselves existing within, the choice to move back into nature and to move into isolation and to sort of trek up the mountain of the divine, to sit with the higher power of life, has always proven to be very, very, very hard. And for that reason, meditation is that process, literally, to sit down and close your eyes. You are emptying the mind and attempting to sort of welcome in the magnificent and the extraordinary and that which is responsible for all of this. But that choice is hard. And so Krishna represents the voice inside us that compels us to rise up that mountain. And Ram represents the same thing, the power to ascend to that space. And so that's the war. And every day when you choose to meditate, all of you have been coming fairly consistently, you are succeeding, you are achieving victory in one particular battle in that war, the battle of today. Cool. So all of that becomes a part of the mantra itself. And now we're using the mantra as a way of measuring time while performing our breath techniques, which makes it all a bit more symbolic, a bit more meaningful, which mirrors the joy of going to a place like India or a place like Nepal or a place like Thailand or a place like Bali, because those cultures have chosen, I'm not sure if Ram is an incarnation of Krishna, but more than likely, they all express themselves, and like the easy answer is all of them. Krishna is an avatar of Vishnu, and Vishnu sort of sits alongside Brahma and Shiva, creator, destroyer, and preserver, and all of them are essentially avatars of Ishvara, of the sort of unspeakable, dimensionless, boundless, infinite one. And when you go to India and you see someone with a little Hanuman or Vishnu or Krishna statue, and you know, I always ask, it's like, oh, you like Krishna, you have preference for Krishna. They don't even acknowledge Krishna or Vishnu. They always say, every time I ask, no, there's only one. There's only one God. This is just my little toy on my tuk-tuk that I like, but it's really just one thing. But yeah, so I hope all that makes sense. When you're repeating the mantra again in homage of like the journey to these places, which actually has an impact on your practice, now your little practice, your little experience as you're breathing the breath technique and all of your awareness is funneling essentially into like your face area, which is a very intimate space, a space of secrets and whispers and intimacy. And now in your mind, instead of numbers, you're repeating these sort of sacred magical words. All the details of that inner experience are pointing in the direction of that spiritual victory. So think about it. It's all not going to, when you're practicing, essentially what's going to happen though is you're going to feel your breath technique as you always do, and you're going to be repeating the stuff as you always do. One little detail that helps me is sort of, creative is when you're repeating the mantra, do your best to imagine a thousand practitioners, 1,000 Indians along the Ganges River, chanting and singing through their voices. And for whatever reason, when I do that, I become a passive observer of my mind chanting the mantra. And in that, I just sort of watch the way a tourist would watch in joy and ecstasy as they observe the devotion of the Indian culture as well. So that's just a little personal tip. What we're going to do now, we have about 15 minutes. We're going to do 7 minutes of breath of fire, which is a fairly long time. So, of course, through those 7 minutes, be modest with your intensity. As you exhale for the breath of fire, try to keep your spine tall and feel it lifting through the chest as the diaphragm yanks in. And then when we get into Nadi Shodhana, same thing, about 7 minutes. Just be very gentle and passive and try to focus on the experience of your face and snout. All right, everyone, happy Friday. Let's get into this. Tall spine, wrists resting on knees. Eyes closed, really straight arms. Shoulder blades draw down your back. And work to build a perfect symmetry. And so because we are used to our physiological imbalances, one shoulder might drop lower than the other. It's helpful to move a little bit, lift one shoulder, lift the other shoulder. And in that movement, in that exploration of what is symmetrical and asymmetrical, you might find that your go-to comfortable posture leans towards one side. Random finger to each thumb. And for me, once I set the mudras, my finger clicks into my thumb, the posture is established. Now warm up breaths. Breathe purely into the stomach so that there's no movement in the rib cage, especially in the upper chest. The nerve receptors in the bottoms of your lungs affect the parasympathetic nervous system, and they support peace. The nerve receptors in the top of the lungs affect the sympathetic nervous system and trigger anxiety. And so you want to start off peaceful. And while it takes more than 2 minutes, when the body is less stressed, it is more willing to learn. Neurologically, stress hormones prevent memory, prevent acquisition of new information. And so even if an epiphany lands on a stressed mind, it has nowhere to root. So breathe into your gut and attempt to feel tranquility build breath